Charles Murray is the W.H. Brady Scholar at the American Enterprise Institute. He first appeared on the national scene in 1984 with the publication of the groundbreaking book Losing Ground. It argued that the Great Society social programs of the 60s and 70s worsened the plight of the poor and the minorities they were intended to help. I can think of a certain socialist senator from Vermont and only slightly less socialist former Secretary of State who could benefit from reading the book. His numerous other books include The Bell Curve, co-authored with the late Richard J. Herrnstein, Coming Apart, The State of White America, and one of my favorite titles, The Curmudgeon's Guide to Getting Ahead, subtitled The Do's and Don'ts of Right Behavior, Tough Thinking, Clear Writing, and Living a Good Life. For his talk today, he'll be drawing on themes from his most recent book, which is titled By the People, Rebuilding Liberty Without Permission. For our final lecture of this Hillsdale College National Leadership Seminar, please welcome Charles Murray.
I have indeed been a Hillsdale regular. I think my first appearance before a Hillsdale audience was right after Losing Ground came out. So we're talking 30 years that I've been speaking to Hillsdale groups, including in Hillsdale itself, where I think either I was marooned in the snow once or I was about to be marooned. And it's always a pleasure. The problem that I have had historically with all of my books is they aren't really ones that cheer you up a whole lot. I have said, it's competitive advantage. I'm really good at describing problems, and I'm not so good at prescribing solutions. Today, I have a little bit of both, because By the People is unique in this regard. The first half, as is traditional for a Charles Murray book, produces clinical depression in anybody who's listening carefully. And the second half is very optimistic, because in the long term, I don't think that we, and by we I mean people who are devoted to limited government and freedom, can lose. But the long term does not refer to the next few presidential cycles. I'll get to this later, but we have a really bad problem insofar as the American project as it was originally conceived is pretty much dead. That's the first part of the lecture. And the second part is that the opportunities for restoring the American project in a new incarnation are very good. Let me start with the depressing part. The American project as conceived by the founders is effectively dead. What do I mean by the American project? You could give a long political, philosophical description of it. I think it's really very simple. I think the essence is the American project was the idea that people can be left free to live their lives as they see fit, as individuals, as families, and as communities, with the government providing a peaceful setting for that endeavor, but otherwise standing aside. When I say it's dead, I don't mean it's dead for everybody. And this is a case which I think people in this room and I myself need to realize. We actually live our lives pretty much as we see fit already. Yeah, there are lots of problems we run into. The government harasses us in various ways. It creates problems in various ways. But the people in this room, including me, have the resources to be able to do workarounds. Sometimes we have people that we hire to take care of some of these problems for us. In other cases, we simply have the resources ourselves to buy our way out of a lot of the ways in which the government gets in our way. That is not true for everybody. There are a lot of people in this country who do not have those resources, and for them the government is intrusive in all sorts of ways, whether they are trying to start a small business or operate a small business, whether they want to put a deck on the back of their house, whether they want simply to get together with their neighbors to put in some playground equipment in a vacant lot so that their kids can use it. In all of these kinds of very pedestrian ways, a whole lot of people cannot live their lives as they see fit. Furthermore, I think that the prospects for using the political process to roll back the reach of government are not good. And let me give you some reasons why. The first of these reasons is that the Constitution, as intended by the founders, is in fact broken beyond repair. And this is something I did not believe when I first started writing the book. I had this impression that we had a series of constitutional decisions over a long period of time that nudged things in the wrong direction on a slippery slope, and we can nudge them back in the right direction. And I was wrong about that. In the 1930s, from 1937 to 1942, there were a handful of Supreme Court decisions which did not nudge. They just simply flipped hugely important constructs of the American Constitution in ways you can't really reverse. Let me use the most famous example of this is Helvering v. Davis. That was the case in which the Supreme Court of the United States said that Social Security was constitutional, even though Social Security did not fall under any of the enumerated powers by any stretch of the imagination. And what the justices of the Supreme Court did was to take this phrase, general welfare, which is in the sentence introducing the enumerated powers, and said, what general welfare means is that in addition to the enumerated powers, Congress can spend on anything which promotes the general welfare. For those of you who are historians of the Revolutionary and Constitutional era, you will remember that during the constitutional ratification debates, the meaning of that phrase was debated endlessly, not with two equal sides arguing whether it did or did not confer this power on the Congress, but rather people saying, that better not mean that it gives that general power. And you had Madison and Jay and the other founders, including Alexander Hamilton, who said, no, 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 it does not do anything of the sort. Well, the Supreme Court said, well, actually it does. Problem is, you can't reverse that. Because if you got 9 Nino Scalias or 9 Clarence Thomases on the court who wanted to reverse Helvering because it wasn't constitutional, they would be declaring that 95% of all spending of the federal government is unconstitutional. No Supreme Court can do that. No president would enforce it. The Supreme Court's legitimacy would be shattered. And the same is true for a variety of other ways in which the Constitution does not mean what the founders wanted it to mean, but we can't go home again. Another way in which we can't use the political process to roll back the use of government has to do with the regulatory state, which I'm going to spend quite a bit of time on today. This is because there have been a couple of things that have gone on. One is that, again, through Supreme Court decision, it is now okay for Congress to pass a very general law saying, we want clean air, and then leave it up to the bureaucrats to implement and create the rules that operationalize what the legislation said. That's new, too. That came about in the 1930s. Before that, the Constitution very clearly says all legislative power shall be vested in Congress of the United States, and what they're doing is delegating legislative power. But it gets worse. Not only do the regulatory agencies make up the rules, in effect creating legislation, they also act as police and courts. Some of you may not know this. I didn't know it before I started writing the book. If the EPA, let's say, comes after you for violating an environmental rule and you want to fight it, guess what? You don't go to a regular court with a regular judge with a jury of your peers. You go to what's called an administrative court. And the judge in that administrative court, because there is no jury, is appointed by the EPA. If surprise, surprise, the judge finds that you are, in fact, in violation of this regulation and you appeal it, you go before an appeals court, which is composed of people appointed by the EPA. And if you finally manage to get out of that into, and there are some cases when you can finally get into a regular federal court, you have a Supreme Court precedent which says, well, we are going to give the benefit of the doubt to the regulatory agency's position if there is any rationale whatsoever for the rule they just made. If this sounds Kafkaesque to you, it is because it is Kafkaesque. But you are not going to get the federal government to say, wait a minute, we're going to start writing legislation again that actually spells out what we want the regulatory agencies to do. And the reason you aren't going to do that goes to the third problem with making progress through the political process, and that is the systemic corruption that now characterizes Washington, D.C. I do not mean that senators and representatives that we have now are more venal or dishonest than they were in the past. I don't think that's true, actually. What we do have is a system which is systemically corrupt. Think of a kleptocracy in a Central Asian country or Southeast Asian country or a Sub-Saharan African country. How do they work? Through bribes. Everything has to have a bribe. You can't get into an office to see somebody unless you pay a bribe. You can't get the legislation to pass anything unless you pay bribes. But if you do pay bribes, you can get a lot of things done. You can get special permissions for your company. You can even get special laws passed which cripple your competitor's ability to compete with you. You can do all sorts of things if you spend enough money. If you substitute for the word bribe campaign contributions, I've just described the way Washington works. I suggest to any of you who have a beef that you need the help of your member of the House of Representatives to help you on, try getting his or her time to hear you out unless you have made an appropriate campaign contribution. It will not, with a very few exceptions, happen. But if you do make the right contributions and so forth, there are all sorts of ways in which the outcomes that you get in a kleptocracy are also the outcomes you can get through Washington. What this means is that you cannot get sweeping legislation that rolls back a whole lot of the overreach of the federal government. There is an economist, some of you may be familiar with, a man named Mansur Olson. He had died some years ago. He was at the University of Maryland. He wrote a couple of seminal books. And what he was really saying is that in an advanced democracy, you have sclerosis. And the reason you have sclerosis is because there's an asymmetry between a special interest that really wants its special benefit and this large amorphous thing called the American public, sugar subsidies. We pay twice the world price for sugar in this country and have for decades. Why? Because of the sugar growers' lobby. Sugar growers are what? 1/100th of the United States? But you can't organize the 99.999% of the United States to oppose it. It's really hard because even though we're paying twice the world price for sugar, you can't get us to get up in arms about it. And hence, every year, the sugar lobby wins. Every year doesn't make any difference how many Republicans have been elected. They just tried to get rid of it last year again for the umpteenth time. You can't mobilize it. Well, if you take the sugar lobby and have 20,000 sugar lobbies, each locking in its own special privilege, you have created a system that is just immobile. You cannot get sweeping reform. Let me hasten to say, you can use the political process to have better policy. You can get better education policy, better welfare policy, better environmental policy in lots of regards. What you can't do is roll back the power of government. And that's where we come to the good news. I have a way. It relies upon an analogy with the Wizard of Oz. This is something that I cannot get away with in talking to millennials because a whole lot of them have never seen the Wizard of Oz. However, looking out over this audience, I think most of you know what I'm talking about, okay? So you remember that at the end of the movie, where Dorothy has been terrified of this booming voice of the Wizard of Oz, along with her compatriots, I think it's the dog, Toto, right, who pulls aside the curtain. And what do you have behind there? You have a little old, balding, overweight guy. This gets a little personal at this point. Who is pretty pathetic. He's not this all-powerful thing that he sounded like when you couldn't see him. The federal government's a lot like that. If the federal government comes after any one of us individually because we have violated one of the rules in its 172,000 pages of the Federal Code of Regulations, we are right to say we can't fight it. And in fact, it's that plight of the individual that got me the incentive to write the book in the first place. True story. Absolutely true story. We have a friend who is in a business, I'm not going to be more specific than that hires a lot of aliens from Central America, does everybody else in his line of work. The difference between him and everybody else is he documents them. He spends something like 25 grand a year on visas, even though he brings the same people back every year. And he pays for their airfares, he pays good wages, way above the minimum wage. He's a great employer, he's a great member of the community, but because he has documented his workers, he has become a visible target. And he is relentlessly harassed. For example, he does not have enough native-born Americans working for him. He can't get native-born Americans to work for him. If the unemployment office sends them out to interview, because that's part of the a requirement for getting unemployment insurance, they sit down in his office and say, I'm out here because they told me I have to, but I don't want to work here. He can't get them. Well, guess what? He is fined large amounts of money for not having native-born American workers that he cannot get. And he said to them on one occasion, I'm going to fight this in court, because he was so angry and so frustrated. And the bureaucrat who was making trouble for him said to him, quote, you try that and we'll put you out of business, close quote. Probably some of you in this room have had similar experiences with bureaucrats over the years. And in fact, they could put him out of business. They could just bleed him dry if he tries to fight it. That made me incredibly angry when I heard about it. And then I had what epiphany is an awfully big word to describe it, but it was pretty close to an epiphany. Certainly I had an image in my mind as the bureaucrat was saying that to our friend, of this mystery man suddenly appearing wearing a black pinstripe suit, carrying a briefcase, tapping the bureaucrat in the shoulder and saying, we are taking this man's case. We are going to litigate this to the end. We are going to make you sick of the sight of us. We are going to publicize what's going on to show how dictatorial you are being. And by the way, that publicity will include publicity about who you are. And at the end of it, when you do find him guilty, because he is technically guilty of violating your stupid regulation, we are going to pay his fine. This made me feel a lot better, just this image of this happening. And then all at once, I said to myself, this could work. What if you had a legal defense fund, sort of like legal aid is now for poor people, but this would be for ordinary Americans who are being victimized by the government for doing nothing wrong but having violated one of their regulations, having harmed nobody, just trying to go about their business. What if you had pushback against bureaucrats who right now have no disincentive whatsoever to bring these kinds of cases? What if you were promising to them you were going to make your life miserable as you go through trying to pursue this allegation? If you did that for a large number of cases and established a track record, you wouldn't have to litigate millions of cases every year. Because once you establish the track record, once you establish your credibility, all a citizen has to be able to do is to go to the harassing bureaucrat and say, oh, I've got good news. The Madison Fund, I call it the Madison Fund. The Madison Fund has agreed to take my case. And you're going to get a whole bunch of regulatory agencies backing off once they know that's the case. That's then the solution. It says, look, we have a Wizard of Oz insofar as this wizard is very scary to any individual, but the real power of that wizard disappears unless you have overwhelmingly voluntary compliance. A place like OSHA does not have hundreds of thousands of inspectors and hundreds of thousands of lawyers. It has actually a relatively small number, and it's responsible for 8 million workplaces. So the chances that you will ever be inspected by OSHA are very small, but they aren't zero. So a lot of people go through a lot of things that have nothing to do with real job safety just because they're worried about an OSHA inspection. What if you could lift this from them? And you could do it. The government cannot enforce all these regulations with the enforcement capability that it has. If we have systematic civil disobedience, we can't legally get things off the books. But we can make large chunks of the federal code of regulations de facto unenforceable. Now, civil disobedience is a really serious strategy to undertake. It requires a really good justification to do it, because the rule of law is, in fact, at the foundation of freedom. Those of us who believe in limited government depend crucially on the rule of law to sustain freedom. If we had any other alternatives to the civil disobedience I'm talking about, I would be going for those first. I am saying, and this is what I spend the first half of the book trying to document, we really don't have any options anymore. And furthermore, we are actually in the same position that the founders were in when they wrote the Declaration of Independence. The government has exceeded its proper role in such blatant ways that it is not only our right, but it is our duty to change things for the better and put government back into its proper box. It is quasi-revolutionary, but the overreach of the government compared to what the founders had in mind is so great, I think it's appropriate. That doesn't mean you can go off helter-skelter, disobeying any law you want. On the contrary, if you are going to implement this strategy, if you're going to have a Madison Fund, or if you're going to have professions get together and establish legal funds that do the same thing, so that dentists have a legal fund that defends dentists who have been senselessly harassed by the government, or a plumber's fund for plumbers who have been senselessly harassed. If you are going to have these kinds of things, you have to pick and choose when it's okay and when it's not okay to ignore the law. And in the book, I have a whole chapter devoted to some of the criteria that need to be used in order to create the situation in which you are saying to people, here are the regulations that we are not going to back you up on if you break them. If you are a mine owner and you have not followed regulations on the strength of the supports of tunnels in your mine, we are not going to come and defend you when your mine tunnel collapses. We're talking about the many, many stupid regulations that can be ignored. You want some examples? Probably a lot of you in this audience could supply me with examples, but here are a few of my favorites. There is the company that was fined for not having the sign poison on a shed to indicate the poisonous material was within. The shed contained beach sand, ordinary beach sand, but OSHA had determined that in certain grinding operations, that beach sand might, not necessarily, but might cause certain kinds of lung problems. Now, none of these grinding operations went on anywhere within the plant that I'm talking about, but they were still fined for that. There was the case, and this was told to me just a couple of weeks ago after I'd given a presentation like this. It was a dentist who said that she had been forced to replace an expensive piece of equipment because it had a paper tag on it as opposed to a metal identification tag. And I said, "You've got to be kidding me on this?" And she said, "No, I'm not kidding you. I had to replace it at a cost of $5,000. Then there is my favorite of all, which is the bartender, a woman, who was fined for not carding a customer. Here's a good case of a lot of the problems with regulations. It's not that the regulation itself is senseless. I think it's okay and appropriate for there to be a regulation that says bars can't run around serving alcohol to 12-year-olds. And so you card people because you have a legal age at which they can drink. That's okay. The person that she failed to card was her father. I mean, just think about that. How could he not be old enough to drink? You know, if she can be a bartender, he's probably got to be old enough to drink. That kind, once again, I said, you are kidding me, right? And she said, no, she wasn't kidding. It was a $3,000 fine, which she did not herself have to pay because the bar sort of under the table said, look, if you will plead guilty to this, we will slip you the $3,000 because if they go after us, the bar, they'll charge us $10,000. And so that's the way they resolved it. These kinds of really foolish, either foolish regulations or regulations that are foolishly enforced constitute a significant chunk of the federal code of regulations, and this is what we're going after. I have lots of criteria for deciding that. It comes down to this. Here's the sort of the defining rule. Suppose this case gets publicized. Will 90% of the American people who hear about it be on the defendant's side? That's the kind of thing you go after, where you have broad agreement across political lines that this is really, really stupid. So, for example, even though I personally am opposed to affirmative action, and probably there is a majority of the American public that's opposed to strong affirmative action, you don't go after those kinds of regulations. Because you wouldn't get 90% agreement. You would have a very broad number of people saying, wait a minute, violating that regulation is wrong because that's doing harm, et cetera, et cetera. You don't go after those. You go after the soft targets, but that's okay because that all by itself will do a lot to reclaim the freedom to live life as we see fit for people who right now don't have the ability to do it. That is the specific strategy that I propose to use to roll back a lot of the power of the government. But it is just the beginning of what I think is coming down the road as possibilities in the future. I think that we are in a particularly propitious moment in 2016 and the decades to come for having a much broader assault on a government that has gotten way out of control. And I'd like to just give you a sense of some of the possibilities. One of these possibilities arises from the increasing diversity of cultures in this country. Now, a lot of times, the increasing diversity of cultures is treated as a bad thing, that we are not assimilating new populations. I'm talking about the arguments about immigration and so forth, and that we are losing our national identity because of that. Well, there's lots of ways in which these things cut both ways, because it's not just ethnic differences in cultures. It's differences in cultures within the population. Here we are in California. San Francisco has a distinctive culture all its own. It's not a conservative culture by any shadow. You know, Portland, Oregon has a very distinctive culture all its own. These are potential flashpoints for people who are traditionally on the left to say to the federal government, the way we live is none of your business. Here's a good example. Here is a portent of what is coming down the pike, and it has to do with states' rights. For the last 50 years, states' rights has been associated with Southerners who were trying to protect their right to practice racial segregation against the federal government, and it's had a really bad name because of that. Well, just a couple of years ago, the states of Washington and of Colorado passed laws permitting the legal use of marijuana that are in direct conflict with federal law. And if there's one part of the Constitution that has remained sacrosanct, it is federal law trumps state law. And yet they have implemented those laws, and there have been no influx of FBI agents or other law enforcement personnel from the federal government to put these state legal operations out of business because they violate federal law. Why did this happen? Well, you see, legalizing marijuana is something that the Department of Justice under Barack Obama's administration is not all that unhappy about. This is a states' rights from the left. And so the Department of Justice said, well, as long as certain broad guidelines are observed in these state laws, we will not enforce the federal laws against them. That's called a precedent. That's a really important precedent. All at once, the federal government is saying, well, you know, maybe states can do things that we have laws against at the federal level, but we can ignore those if they happen to be laws that we don't particularly want to enforce. That can come back to bite them in the ankle as time goes on, because there are lots of different populations out there that have lots of different ways they'd like to live, and the states are getting feisty about asserting those rights. And so are communities getting feisty about asserting those rights. And the really good thing is, it isn't a bunch of right-wing crazies like us who are out there saying, this is the way we want states to have more authority, we want communities to have more authority. It's people on the left. This is the kind of potential alliance that can be formed across left and right, I think increasingly, because, and this is another way in which we are in a propitious moment, people on the left, as well as people on the right, are increasingly aware of how utterly incompetent government usually is. We all use the internet these days, a lot. When was the last time you voluntarily went to a government website when you had a question? If you have a question about health, you don't go to the Department of Health and Human Services. You go to WebMD and get an answer to it, and you get a good answer. If you are required to go to a government website because you got to file a form on the internet, what do you always notice about the websites of the government? Is they're really bad. And bad, I mean clunky. They don't work very well. You compare that with the websites put up by corporations, these evil corporations, they make life very easy for you. They make the services they provide or the products they provide easier to get, easier to use, and the rest of it. It's increasingly visible to everybody that you don't use government to do anything for you if you have the option of using a private service instead. And that's just as true of people on the left as people on the right. People do not voluntarily go to government cafeterias unless they have to, okay? They will go out and eat at the local McDonald's outside the door rather than stay in the government cafeteria. Things small and large that's true about. That increasing realization of the incompetence of government has spillover effects on the potential coalitions between people who disagree about which presidential candidate they're going to vote for, but agree that actually they'd like the government to butt out of certain things that they jointly would like to see the government butt out of. A second way in which things are going to change for the better, and we are in a propitious moment, has to do with technology. And here we are at the very beginning of what we are going to see is possible. 4 letters, U-B-E-R, Uber. I don't know how many of you use Uber. I know that one of our leading presidential nominees, Hillary Clinton, said the idea of Uber was quite scary, which I suppose is true if you're 68 years old and you haven't driven yourself for the last 20 years. Yeah, I suppose it's scary to you, but to the rest of us, Uber is great. You go online. For those of you who haven't used it, there's Uber. You are on the app. You need to get from point A to point B. You don't stand out in the rain trying to flag down a taxi. A taxi, when it finally does arrive, is probably kind of dirty inside, and the trunk is filled with stuff, and the driver may not know where he's going. No, you've got Uber. You tell them where you want to go. You tell them where you are. You can see on the screen where the cars are that come to pick you up. They then tell you such and such a car is on the way, driven by so-and-so. Here's the phone number, so you can call him to correct things if you've changed your pickup location. Picks you up. You get in the car. Your credit card information is on file with Uber already, so you just get picked up. You're dropped off. You don't pay a tip. You don't put a credit card in a slot. It's like being picked up by an acquaintance and dropped off where you want to go. And not only that, and what I'm about to say now is absolutely key to non-governmental solutions to problems. You rate the driver, and the driver rates you. So that at the end of every Uber ride, Uber asks you to give a number of stars to your ride. And if there's anything wrong, you can downgrade it. The fact is that Uber drivers are scared to death of getting anything less than 5 stars, which is the maximum number. Because if there are even 4 stars, with a couple of them, Uber's going to start asking questions about what's going on. So they're desperate to get a 5, which makes for really cheerful, polite Uber drivers. But if you are a jerk as a customer, that information is also out there. So when you put in a call for an Uber car, your information comes up on the driver's screen, and if it says, this person is really a jerk, probably you aren't going to get picked up. It's wonderful. It's wonderful because you're each rating each other. Same thing goes for Airbnb. I don't know how many of you are familiar with that. This is where you rent a room in someone's home. It's like a bed and breakfast thing, and you rate the quality of the room and so forth. Sometimes it's the entire house. You are also rated about whether you left the house a mess when you moved out again. And so you have these services being provided by people who are voluntarily cooperating with each other. But here's the greatest of all things about Uber. It taught us that not only is the government theoretically the Wizard of Oz, it is really the Wizard of Oz in its powerlessness. The monopolies that taxi companies and city councils have established throughout the United States have artificially made it hard to get a cab for decades. But it has been assumed, well, there's really no way to break into that monopoly for the same reasons I described earlier about how hard it is to get things changed in Washington. It never occurred to anybody, instead of trying to break the monopoly, what if you just show up and start offering your service without asking permission? And that's what Uber did. Shows up, starts doing this, and by the time the city council and the taxi company monopoly get their act together, Uber in many cities has become so popular that there's a political price to be paid for getting rid of it. That's exactly what happened in Washington, D.C. City council passed a motion saying Uber was illegal, and you know what? There are a whole lot of people in Washington who take a whole lot of cabs, including people who are really powerful, and both left and right, and they wanted to keep Uber, and the city council had to back down. Those are kinds of ways in which the technology, information technology, is not just used for websites and answering questions and things and buying books. It is being used to bypass the power of government. And what we have seen with Uber and Airbnb and the rest is just the very beginning of what's coming on the way. There are also things that can be done through information technology which undercut the rationale for government intervention. If you're talking about 1905 or 1906, when the first major government intervention in food inspection occurred, the Pure Food and Drug Act, you know what? Back in 1905, there was a really good rationale, saying it's really hard for customers to know what's in this supposed bottle of medicine or what the quality of the meat is, and we really need the government to act as a third party, an honest broker who will let consumers know and protect consumers. It would have made sense, it did make sense in 1905. It's 2016. Suppose we repealed the requirement for meat inspection by the government. If Safeway were then to decide, gee, we can make an extra 1.5 cents per pound on meat if we cut corners on its quality, it would be all over the internet in 24 hours and Safeway would go broke. It would be that fast if you had people trying to pass off bad meat because there were no longer any government inspectors. What's going to happen instead if you get rid of the government's role? Safeway and everybody else will be putting out ads saying, you know what? Actually, our internal standards for inspecting meat have been higher than the federal government's for years now, which is true. And here they are, and you are absolutely safe, and you would improve the quality of the product rather than degrade it if you got the government out of the business. The government would no longer have the same rationale. The federal government would have no longer the same rationale for interfering in local affairs. It used to be the case, 100 years ago, you did have company towns that used hired goons to intimidate workers from forming unions. You did have hired goons who would not only oppress but sometimes kill black people in the South because they were not behaving the way that they were supposed to behave. These were real problems. You really did need to have a government from outside which helped to prevent some of those problems. Today, there is nothing that 60 Minutes and also all of the evening news shows in local television stations around the country love more than to discover somebody who's behaving badly in that kind of a way. You have a vastly more effective surveillance of bad behavior now, which can be kicked in not by knocking timidly on the government's door and seeing if they'll do anything about it, but calling up the local news station and saying, "Have I got a story for you?" All of this has undercut the rationale for government in all sorts of ways. I said I was optimistic in the long term. And when I say that to audiences, and then I say in 200 years, and they're all thinking of John Maynard Keynes, who said, in the long run, we're all dead. Well, that's true. But you know what? I don't think that makes much difference for a lot of us. I think the problem with being devoted to a cause, as the supporters of Hillsdale are devoted to a cause, is not whether you're going to win right away, but whether you think you just are ultimately doomed and it's never going to happen. So if I think, no, we're going to win eventually, it's not that important that it happened while I'm around to see it. And here's the way I think about it. The advances in information technology I just described 200 years from now, or even a century from now, 100 years from now, are going to be so much greater than they are now. We can't conceivably imagine. All sorts of other kinds of technological advances will have empowered the individual in ways that we can't imagine now. In 100 years, assuming that economic growth continues the secular increase that has characterized it since we first started measuring GDP back in 1886, we are going to be unimaginably wealthier as a society than we are now. Now, is it possible that we could have leadership of such Soviet stupidity that that economic growth stops? Yeah, I suppose it could happen. Odds are that won't happen. So you have vastly increased technological capabilities that empower individuals. You have vastly more money sloshing around than you have now. It is inconceivable to me that under those circumstances, people will still think that the best way to run society is with thousands of laws enforced by tens of thousands of bureaucrats. It just doesn't compute as far as I can see. In the book, I try to describe some specific ways in which the logjam could be broken, but that it can be broken seems to me to be beyond doubt. And it's really important that we do so. You know, we are not advocates for limited governments because of abstract political principles nearly as much, in my view. We are for it because it is the way that people live satisfying lives. It is also the thing that has made the United States unique. There are many other countries around the world in which I could live a satisfying life, just among the countries that I happen to know personally. So it's not as if the United States is the only good place to live in the world. But we have been unique in that we are the only nation in the world that was created with a charter of freedom as we were, that people ought to be able to live their lives as they see fit, free of interference. Since the United States was created, no other country has copied us. No other country has modified its charter so that it is more like us. We have been unique. And we also developed a unique civic culture, a way for people to live together within their communities that has no real counterpart anywhere else in the world. There are lots of places in the world with friendly people, Lots of places in the world with wonderful traditions of hospitality. Very few, in fact, no country in the world, which has the history of people who happen to live in geographic proximity to each other, voluntarily cooperating to solve problems and get along, as the United States traditional civic culture did. If we stop that, and that civic culture disappears, we will have lost something irreplaceable, no matter how many other nice countries there are in the world. I think that the challenge for the American people right now, and I'm speaking not only of those of us who already love limited government, but all the people of all kinds of political views who treasure the unique civic culture of the United States, to ask themselves how much they treasure and what they're willing to do to defend it. Because if it is lost, that loss will be irreplaceable. The good news is it doesn't have to be lost. It can be redrawn in a new incarnation in a way which, once again, will let all the people, not just the rich ones, but all the people, live their lives as they see fit. Thank you very much.
We have some time for questions. Please raise your hand if you have one.
We do have some organizations which do what you suggested, taking on cases against the government. I can think of several: the Goldwater Foundation, Pacific Legal Foundation. I've been on the board of Mountain States Legal Foundation for a number of years. It's a 30-year-old. Our signature case has been affirmative action. We took it to the Supreme Court and we won twice. It doesn't really, it has to be redone every time, but still it is out there, so it can be done. These cases are taken at no cost to the people who can't afford it.
The work of Pacific Legal Foundation, Goldwater Institute, the Institute for Justice is terrific, and many of you in this room are already familiar with them. Here's the difference between what I'm talking about, what they do. They have very limited resources, and so they choose cases very carefully that they can win. Because if they win them, they establish a legal precedent that gives them leverage. They have done a fantastic job. The Pacific Legal Foundation, besides its affirmative action cases, the Sackett case that went to the Supreme Court establishing property owners' rights to argue with the EPA was a landmark thing. The first people I went to, since I live in the Washington, D.C. area, not on the West Coast, when I started working on this book, was the Institute for Justice, to get their help in doing it. They do great work. I want to make those institutes have vastly expanded power through the kind of thing I'm talking about. Somebody else, if I'm having a hard time seeing hands go up, so.
Over here.
Okay.
Yes. What do you think the proposed constitutional convention could make on the constitutional crisis, the Convention of States?
Well, as a practical matter, I don't think it's going to happen. And furthermore, I think it was Justice Scalia who said, I think appropriately, in the 21st century, given the predominant political climate in this country, it'd be really scary to have a constitutional convention, because once you had it, you could not be at all sure that the kinds of things that would come out of it are things that limited government advocates would want. Actually, given the intellectual climate and the rest of it, you'd end up, if you aren't careful, I think, with a worse constitution than we have now. So point number one is, I think it's been a practical matter. It's going to be really hard to organize it. Number two is, keeping control of that constitutional convention, really, really a dicey thing to do. See, My pessimistic side is just waiting for a chance to come out again. Yeah.
Yes, in the first part of your talk, you seem to describe campaign contributions as sort of an inherently corrupt system, but isn't that an inherent part of our American, the way we conduct our democracy? We spend the money we earn, the money we make to support the people who will represent us.
Yeah, no, there's nothing wrong with campaign contributions as a way of giving voice to political speech. When I said systemic, I really meant it that way. And you've raised an interesting question that I don't want to do a 10-minute riff on, so let me say it real quickly. Back in the 1970s, you had campaign reform, which limited the amount of money that individuals could give. And the purpose of it was to take the influence of really wealthy people out of politics. You know what the reality was before there were limits on individual contributions? Yeah, you had some members of Congress who were there because they had a patron back in their home district of South Carolina, let's say. And probably that patron who gave a lot of money had particular interests that he would really like that congressman to vote his way on. But that's just one or two things. Mostly he's contributed the money, but 98% of the decisions that the congressman makes are going to flow from the congressman's political principles, which presumably were congenial to the guy who gave him the money. So in effect, the congressman was maybe constrained in some votes on how he voted, but not a lot. The unintended consequence, one of the many, that happened with the limits on individual contributions was it energized the PACs. So before, if you were ardent in favor of conservation, it was really kind of hard to do anything with that money that was going to directly impact a vote on environmental legislation. But then you got the Sierra Club, you got the others, all at once you've got this vehicle for getting your particular cause better represented. That also sounds okay until you realize that now every single vote that a member of Congress takes has a whole bunch of really passionate constituencies that have been giving money. There is no such thing anymore as a congressperson who is free to vote his or her conscience and not suffer repercussions if they don't vote the way this complex web of special interests wants. That's a really short Cliff Notes version. Not against campaign contributions. The system we've created has really gone haywire. Yes.
Mr. Murray, over here. Thank you for your speech, particularly for your optimism. We're always have our ear to the ground, hoping that we can hear something that will give us some hope, and appreciate it. The one thing, a dimension of our condition, maybe a factor that I worry most about at present, is the tens of trillions of dollars of debt on the books and additional tens of trillions of unfunded liability. And it makes me a bit skeptical about being optimistic at all, particularly if we depend on future development of technology and so forth. So
Yeah.
would you comment on that?
Again, you have a mirror side which says this provides an opportunity as well as a danger. Let's face it, Congress is not going to act on the things that are creating this huge deficit until they absolutely have to. And they absolutely have to because their heads and trunks and the upper part of their bodies are hanging over the cliff. That's what it's going to take to get there. But at some point that's going to happen, and it's not going to be in the very distant future, given the projections for the cost of government. And at that point, there become ways of saying, you know what, here's an alternative way of doing things, and you have to make major reforms, you don't have any choice, and here's a way you can do it that will also, incidentally, be a way that gets government out of people's lives. I am having a reissue of a book that I wrote in 2004 that is coming out a couple of months from now. It's called In Our Hands, A Plan to Replace the Welfare State. And the reason there is a new edition coming out 12 years after the first one is because what I argued then, which is for replacing, not adding to, but replacing the welfare state with a guaranteed annual income is now not only financially feasible, it is one of the only available ways that the government can get out from under the kinds of obligations it has now. Now, I'm not going to go into a defense of the guaranteed annual income in this Q&A period. I'm simply saying that there will be opportunities as we approach that cliff, knowing that there must be major reforms because we are not going to be able to pay our bills otherwise, in which solutions more congenial to limited government become practicable in a way they are not now. So I will persist in that optimism, having also acknowledged what you implied, which is you would think that the government would finally respond when it's hanging over the edge of the cliff, but maybe they won't. Maybe they're too stupid to do that. Let's not dwell on that.
Dr. Murray, you gave the characterization of federal regulatory bureaucrats as the man behind the curtain in The Wizard of Oz. My experience has been they're more like the flying monkeys from the Wicked Witch of the West. And I find those flying monkeys very disturbing, more so every day, because the example followed by the Obama administration in particular has been that federal bureaucrats are not just buffoons enforcing ridiculous laws, but they're agents to punish the opposition. And that opposition is now drilled down to the mere citizen. I'm talking about the IRS thing. I'm talking about the Gibson guitar thing, which appears to be a retaliation against political contributions. But what do you think, in the short term, of the federal government, particularly at the highest, at the White House level, using the federal bureaucracy to punish and destroy opponents? Thank you.
Well, just to add to the potential scariness of what you refer to, I don't know how many of you are familiar with this facility in Utah that the NSA is building. This is for storage of the stuff it brings in, and NSA basically has the capability to listen to everything, oversee everything. Well, I'm actually not that scared about NSA misusing the data, but I am really scared about all of that stuff that's getting stored forever, because I think it is inevitable that politicians will eventually start misusing it. What I'm about to say is perhaps more hopeful than is warranted, but there's some basis for it. We're talking about really, really sophisticated computer capabilities, information technology we have. I think that most of the talent for that is in the private sector. And you also have in Silicon Valley an awful lot of people who are actually quite libertarian in Silicon Valley. I know Silicon Valley votes for Democratic candidates, but that's for reasons that I think have very little to do with political philosophy and a whole lot to do with just what's fashionable. But in terms of the way they look at it, you have a massive amount of really high-powered skills out there that is really hates that kind of misuse of government power. And I think that mobilizing that, you don't have to have an organization to mobilize it. I think that those hackers can probably beat the kind of hackers that the federal government can get to work for it. So it could play out wrong. It could play out very badly. It's very scary. What the Obama administration has done crosses a few lines that haven't been crossed before, but in many ways it's just an extension of what the federal executive branch has been doing over the last 3 or 4 decades. You're going to have people in the private sector rise up and block it. That's what I want to do with the civil disobedience. In the case of these capabilities, I think a lot of the resistance is going to come from the hackers out in Silicon Valley. Hope so.
This will be our final question.
Thank you for giving us some optimism. Wanted to ask you where I can learn more about the Monroe Fund, and is that already a practice that's already?
The Madison Fund, yeah, I've named it Madison after, since Madison was so central to the Constitution. The short answer is that after the book came out, I got all these emails, I mean, lots of them, saying, you know, well, I want to give money to the Madison Fund. I'm a lawyer and I want to contribute my services. And my response internally was to say, I write books. You know, I don't start complex entrepreneurial/philanthropic foundations. But I am happy to say that at least one person I know is prepared to commit 7 figures, substantial 7 figures, as his contribution to a Madison Fund. And I think that I know that there have been some exploratory feasibility analyses that have started. So I have hopes that something will come of all of this. Probably won't be exactly the way that I'm sure it won't be exactly the way I described it in the book. But in all of these things that I've been talking about, I'm not describing problems where you have to persuade people who are hard to persuade. It's really hard to persuade people who are social democrats that actually libertarians or limited government advocates are right. It's really hard to shift them from there to where we are. It's not hard at all to say, you know, the way they're getting in our way is none of their business. It's just wrong. That you can persuade, and that is a response I've gotten from the book, which is very heartening. It's not limited to people who hold the political views of those in this room. It is a sense broader in the American people of something really essential about how this country runs, which has been lost, and that's an easy sell, and that's really good news. It's been great to be back at Hillsdale. Thank you very much for having me.